Today's video is the second of my 3 top tips for learning new pieces. It picks up from where we left off in the last video and details how we can go about working on the piece once we've divided it into its component parts, the sections, segments and snippets as I explained last time. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists or indeed anyone who loves piano to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, then please do think about subscribing. Simply click the little icon in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen now, and it's all done for you. As I explained in the first video in this series of 3 top tips, my first tip is to divide our music into its building blocks, and that I nickname sections, segments and snippets. And as you might imagine, the next step then is to work out how we're going to actually practice each individual snippet. So quickly reminding you of how we can think of snippets, they are a little like the individual shots that filmmakers use in a blockbuster or a TV program. And whilst each individual shot might be small and last no more than a second or two sometimes, each one is very finely judged in terms of the lighting, camera angle, camera movement, and all of these things. Similarly, our snippets might be very small. However, we need to assign exactly the same amount of care to each one of them. And when I first started using this idea, I'll be honest, right? I predominantly focused on them as being a way of getting the notes under control. I rarely really considered the music at this level. However, I've come to realize that that was a big mistake. Each snippet needs to be considered musically, okay, within the context of the snippets around it, but each one needs to be considered. So how do we go about doing this? Musically, of course, we need to study our score very closely. What are the phrase markings? What are the dynamics? The way that the notes are grouped on the page, the direction of the stems. How does that compare with the previous measure? And also, how does it compare with the one that's following it? And studying all of these tiny things helps us to musically decide what we want to do with it and what the composer intended. Only now we know that are we ready to really think about how we're going to practice it. And the practice approach I use here I've called variance. And you will have heard me mention this term before in other videos if you're a regular viewer. Now, a variant is simply a way of practicing something. So to me, slow practice is simply a variant. Certainly, it's often a very sensible starting point as it helps us understand the notes and work out our fingering. Another variant might be hand separately. Although I do invite you to watch my other video on why I think that it's often overused, in fact. However, these are only the tip of the iceberg, and we can take practice variants a whole lot further. In fact, I find that snippets generally will fall into a number of categories. There is those that will be relatively straightforward for us. There will be others that are, that are a bit challenging, but on the whole manageable. And then there will be others that at first seem pretty much approaching impossible. In fact, this reminds me of a favourite quote that says, "There's no such thing as difficult music. It's either easy or impossible. The way it migrates from one category to the other is called practice." I have discovered that the more challenging a snippet is likely to be, the greater number of variants that we'll need to find. For those that appear relatively straightforward, the simple variant of slowly might potentially be all we need. Go through it a couple of times slowly and after that we'll probably be okay. However, as we move upwards on the difficulty stakes, I found that this isn't sufficient in any way. Depending on the challenge we're trying to overcome, then we need to seek out variants that will help us. And the object of using variants is to try to find a way that allows us to practice something that otherwise we'd find impossible to do effectively. Let's use the example, say, of a passage in octaves, right? If, like me, you're not very confident with octaves, then simply hammering away at octaves will A, sound awful, and B, not really help. Therefore, we need to find things that will help us to effectively practice them as we build the skill. Often, in a case like this, I look for simplifying variants. So that's a variant that makes the problem easier for us to manage. And advice I've seen for octaves from Graham Fitch and Josh Wright is to practice them with either just the thumbs or just the pinkies. And the principle is that we mimic the hand movement we need to replicate without the challenge of holding the octave. We also get to learn the notes as well we need to use without the physical challenge of the octave itself. We can practice our thumb variant using rhythms as well, an excellent way of solving many problems. And we have the simple dotted rhythm, or we can use more complex rhythms. Don't forget, we can equally do this when we're practicing with the full octaves as well. We could use the doubling variant that I talked about in a video a couple of weeks ago. Indeed, the only real limit is our imagination here. Effectively, we need to simplify something enough for us to be able to practice it, even if in the case of these octaves we're only practicing a part of the problem at first. If we're unable to get that passage with just the thumbs, for example, then I can guarantee 100% that we'll completely fail if we try to do it with the octaves. However, getting to the point where we can control the thumb variant is much easier than immediately trying to tackle the octave version. And that perhaps is the power tip of this approach. We work towards identifying variants that get progressively more difficult, so we start out as simply as we can and build out from there. This is a concept I discussed at length in my video on the Liszt Liebestraum number 3 second cadenza. To give some other examples of variants, there's of course my 4/4 waltz technique that effectively gives us 4 different variants we can use for each snippet for anything in 3/4 time. There is the idea of simplifying a complex left-hand arpeggio too into block chords to help our fingers get used to the shape and to the position. Another simplification strategy is to omit some of the notes at first. I'm currently working on an abridged version of Chopin's Ballade No. 4, and for this particular passage here, my starting point is to simply play the notes where both hands play together and omit the others whilst my brain gets used to this complex texture. Whatever the challenge, you'll find that with a little research, there are always lots of ways of approaching something. My major go-to resource for this is in fact Graham Fitch's ebook series, which gives hundreds, perhaps even thousands of examples of different practice approaches we can use to form our variants. And I've linked this as usual in the description below for you. You'll even find in my Practice Ideas playlist lots of different ideas illustrated with various pieces I've been learning over the past few years. So to repeat the basic principle, the more difficult we think we're going to find something, the more variants we're likely to need. And we may well need to find different variants that serve as stepping stones to get us from impossible to easy. However, even for easier music, I'd recommend using more than a single variant, as it really does help solidify things. Also, let's not forget that sometimes the challenge is not necessarily physical. I've learned lots of pieces that, based on the dots as I see them on the page in front of me, should have been relatively easy, yet I still found them a great challenge mentally to play them as I wanted. Whatever the difficulty may be, it's critical that we stick with our snippets initially, as trying to accomplish something difficult with a limited number of notes is far easier than doing it with a greater number. Equally, it's far easier to remember 10 notes at a time than it is to remember 100. As I said in the first video in the series, ultimately we want to get to a performance variant, so reaching a point where we're practicing something as we wish to perform it. Therefore, less here is most definitely more. My next video in this series looks at how we can then start putting these snippets back into their segments, and then ultimately the segments into sections, and the sections into the entire piece. Ensure you've subscribed and click the little bell so you're notified of this next video when it's released, as I discovered that it's not just as simple as adding things together, and I'm looking forward to explaining to you what I've learned about this process. If by the time you do see this video and the next one's already been released, then it will be linked here for you now. Thank you very much for watching today, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.